Hello out there, my name is David Miller. I'm a Phoenix, Arizona multimedia artist, photographer, and educator. I want to welcome you to this course on cutting-edge photographic composition. Now, there are a lot of video classes about photographic composition, and my guess is the majority of them say the same thing. They talk about the rule of thirds, they talk about placing your horizon line in either the upper third or the lower third. They talk about ways to tell a story by placing objects in certain positions throughout your rectangular frame. And all of that advice is good, it's useful. There is more to life though than composing a photo. There are ways to be creative with our compositions though, and there are ways to be a lot bolder than simply operating within those same tried and true composition techniques. We are going to be experimental. We are going to try things that are outside of the box, and I'm going to show you a lot of world-class photographers who are experimental with their compositions. And one of the things I really try to push in all of my classes is the work that stands the test of time, the work that people celebrate in museums, in galleries, in history books. It always is the work that pushes the boundaries and creates something new. So if you feel like you're repeating the same compositions in your shots over and over and over again, this class is absolutely for you. If you feel like you're ready for a challenge and you want to be a groundbreaking artist, then hopefully you feel like this class is for you. I'm going to be using a variety of cameras for this class. All you need is one. It could be as simple as your phone camera or as elaborate as a DSLR. I'm also going to be using some instant film cameras because I do a lot of my work with that. And I think there's some unique composition you can do with instant film. So I'm going to be showing you some of that work as well. I'm going to be highlighting a lot of well-known photographers and breaking down what it is they do in their pictures that is so cutting edge composition wise. I'm going to be using Adobe Lightroom to do some of my post-production. So if you have any kind of camera and you have access to Adobe Lightroom, you're going to be able to keep up with the class and follow along without any problems. Let's get started. If you've ever taken an art class, you've heard about the elements of art, and you've probably heard about scale and the use of positive, negative space in your drawing or painting compositions. The same applies in photography, and a lot of times when people are talking about photographic composition, they are specifically talking about how to fill the entire frame with stuff, how to tell a story through having things at all these critical junctures involving the rule of thirds, having leading lines point this way and that way. And one thing that's kind of left out in that conversation is the fact that you don't have to have anything in those spaces. In fact, you can express emotion by virtue of having emptiness around your subjects. So scale in photography does not necessarily mean that your subjects are small in comparison to this vast emptiness around them. Certainly you could use scale by having something very large, very close to you. You can shoot macro, you can have a subject that is large next to a subject that is small and utilize scale in that way. But for the purposes of our cutting edge compositions, we're going to look at pictures that have a very small figure and a lot of negative space around them. These figures don't necessarily have to be placed alongside any of the intersections that the rule of thirds would imply you'd have to place objects at. It's just a matter of having a balance between some small figure and some vast sea of color, of white, of nothing. No matter where your figure is in this negative space, you are portraying the relationship between one thing and another, and that still is valid compositionally. One of my favorite photographers of all time, Guy Bourdin, utilizes this a lot in his fashion and beauty related compositions. In the case of this image, by having a large wall with a small hole in it, the model is essentially reduced to mouse size. Even though there's nothing else that's particularly large in scale. It's just the idea of a person shot from far away disappearing into a hole, that hole matching a large field that resembles a wall. You have two models interacting across the street. I'm not sure if it's a dance or if it's a fight, but they're very small in scale in relation to the large industrial building that's around them. And that industrial building is by no means the subject of this scene, but it evokes the emotion you get when you witness something happening across the street and you're not quite sure what it is. If people are partying, if they're pranking each other. This is something that's happened to me a few times in my life. And when I came across this Guy Bourdin image, I absolutely recognized that was the vibe he was going for. Then we have this image by Charles Harbutt, and this particular image is a person small in a corner. They're surrounded by wallpaper texture, and it's essentially a large pattern that has your subject breaking the pattern. So even though the subject isn't properly placed, if we were to go by rule of thirds, they definitely draw your eye because they are breaking an established pattern. And by having the person small and in a corner, it really gives you the sense of almost like a mental illness or a sadness or a depression. I have heard it said that if you want to draw a sad man, all you need to do is take a regular piece of paper and do a tiny little figure sitting down. And having all this overwhelming negative space around them is a great graphic way of representing alienation and loneliness. Note in all of these examples, when I have a subject that's small in scale, it's against some contrasting background that allows me to see the subject. So this is one of the complaints a lot of people have in wildlife photography, that the animals they're trying to photograph are way too far away and they blend in with the background, because traditionally animals live in environments that they blend into. It's just a survival mechanism. They've all developed some sort of camouflage. Brown animals live in wooded environments and so on and so forth. But I do want to show you some wildlife photographs that showcase animals very small in scale relative to their environments, and because they're shot against contrasting colors, they pop out as much as if you shot them close up. In some of my own work, I have definitely placed the subject very small in scale in relation to the space that's around the person. Oftentimes when I am able to shoot from a distance, I look at the pictures on the computer and realize that I'm not actually as far away as I'd like to be, or that the image would be more striking if there was even more space around them. So in a case like this image, I shot the model from above. She was in a cyclorama, which is a large curved white field that you find in professional photo studios. And then in Photoshop, I expanded this white field around her so it really emphasized the embryonic fetal position of where she's at. I wanted to make her seem more like somebody who's drifting through the cosmos, through empty space. This image is very similar. It was shot in the same studio, but the particular pose the model had really felt like she was falling, and I think it's perfectly fine to go into whatever editing program or darkroom technique you have and do the best you can to tell the story you want to tell. So this was another image where I built out the white space around the model to really emphasize that feeling of falling through a large empty void. And if I did not build out this space around the model, then you would have just seen a person in a pose. But by building out the space and shrinking the subject in scale, it definitely tells the story in the way that I meant to tell it, but couldn't tell it because I did not have a ladder that extended 100 feet in the air at the time of the shooting. One of the great things about photography as a medium is that it's very quick to get multiple images. If someone chose to create a sequence of paintings, it's going to take a long period of time, and it's going to be difficult for the painter to get these micro moments that one might be able to get in photography. where you can take an image and a second later take another image, and a second later take another image, and have those add up to be something greater than each individual image in itself. So we're going to look at a couple different approaches to creating sequences of images. One of the classics of the art photography world is Dwayne Michaels, who creates little stories or tableaus with his imagery. This particular one is simply 3 stills of Andy Warhol in various states of motion. Other Dwayne Michaels images incorporate writing in the way that a children's storybook or a comic book might incorporate writing within its paneling. This set of images tell the story of an old woman who takes a child to a park and subsequently disappears by the final frame. This sequence tells the story of a spirit leaving a dying man's body. Creating sequences is nothing new in art. A lot of religious artwork is depicted as triptychs or diptychs. Individually, it might be hard to determine which of these 3 images is the stronger one, and certainly there are photographers who would present them each individually, but by sequencing them together as a triptych, it not only gives you a sense that this is a family unit, but it also highlights the individuality of each girl's pose. These images are unintentional diptychs. They were taken of Australian criminals during their mugshot process. And as I mentioned in a previous lesson, history can turn anything to art if enough time has passed. These have definitely become elevated into being art. Not only do they showcase the personalities of their subjects, but they do it in a really gritty environment. Each one has a close-up and a full body shot, and it has a little graphic element of writing to tie it all together. Individually, these images are great. Together, they are extraordinarily powerful. These sequences showcase landscape photography in a whole new way. The elements that are close to the bottom of the frame are much closer. The photographer chose to use close-up photos at the bottom of the frame, and as he got to the top of his collaged frame, he utilized elements that are further away in the background. It creates this sense of you being there. It's a way of highlighting particular details, as if to say, pay attention to this flower, pay attention to this rock. And it's also a way of presenting a landscape in a really unique new 21st century fashion that feels more exciting, vibrant, and fresh than if it was just a single image of the entire scene. Each time I move from one frame to another, my mind has to connect the two. And as I said in one of the other lessons, anything you can do to get your viewer to interact with the photograph on a mental level can only be a good thing. In this section, I want to talk about the layered scene. Oftentimes when people address composition, they think of everything as 2-dimensional elements. And certainly if you are doing some sort of portrait session in a studio where you have your portrait subject and you have a flat background, it's hard to get away from the idea that this is just a simple 2-dimensional scene. But if we think 3-dimensionally, and we're out in an environment that has space, you have subjects that are near, you have subject matter that's far, and you have subject matter that's very far away, and then you have contrasting natural elements like clouds, stars, sky, the sun, trees, mountains, and so forth. Ansel Adams made very layered compositions in his works, and they're very traditional compositions to be sure. Ansel Adams emphasized a large depth of field in his compositions, so everything is sharp. When you have a layered scene though, you can create some really interesting compositions by utilizing small depths of field, meaning that only a small percentage of your photograph is in focus. And you can really accomplish this if you pick something that is in the middle ground. So not something that's super close to you and not the things that are very far away, but something in the middle. So the objects that are near are out of focus and the objects that are far away are out of focus. Famed band photographer Anton Corbijn is a master of utilizing this technique. And while some of the photographs I'll show you have the objects in the very front foreground in focus, one of his most common techniques is to blur those objects and have this relationship between near, far, very far. It creates a very rich and believable environment for the overall photograph. One of the added benefits of the layered photographic approach is the sense you give your viewers of actually being there. It's a very cinematic approach to photography. If you think of movies, whenever they change from one setting to another, they have to use an establishing shot to showcase where you're at, so you, the viewer, can readjust your mindset of what's happening. This is usually done through a wide shot, maybe a crane shot, something that's overhead and gives you the lay of the land. It might be through a tracking shot or a dolly shot where the camera is moving at a particular angle until we arrive at our subjects. But when someone like Corbin does this layered approach, I have a sense that I could move one direction or another in the photograph. I could actually interact with this thing. In a way, these shots are a little more difficult to compose in person because you're involving a moving part that's close, a moving part that's far away, and some elements that are completely out of your control. But when you pull this type of shot off with many layers to it, it is highly rewarding. Lastly, I want to talk about adding graphic design elements to your photography. And what differentiates this from the previous lesson on collage and glitch style photography is graphic design is a little more deliberate with its communication. And typically it ties into some past utilitarian use of graphic design. For example, artists who block out an element of their image really refers to the use of whiteout correctional fluid or black redaction in government documents. So we can have graphic design by addition of elements, be they physical elements or things like stitching, which is something I've seen in a lot of modern day fashion photography. You can have graphic design by omission, which is where you cut things out of a photograph. In this case, actually cutting the middle out of a photograph. Artist John Hartfield utilized these graphic design approaches, and because a lot of Hartfield's surviving work was in the form of magazine publications or posters, in the modern era, when we see these in a museum, they have the additional graphic elements of being within a printed page. Frank Ockenfels III is a modern-day celebrity and band photographer who utilizes this approach a lot. Work that he does for television shows such as Breaking Bad and Mad Men comes across as sort of standard advertising fare that fits the aesthetic of those particular shows. But Frank also creates his own personal journal work where the photograph is really just the starting point. And these graphic design elements that Frank includes really have no limitation. They might involve cutting, they might involve ink, but the presentation of the final journal page is the complete page, and the photograph is just a single part of it. In my own personal work, I've done a lot with graphic design on my photographs, and oftentimes it's a good way to approach a photograph that is actually quite generic in its embryonic state. And when I shoot these, maybe that's intentional, maybe I had planned on doing some alteration at a later date, or maybe it was just a matter of me going through my archives and finding photos where I liked something, but overall it was lacking in visual appeal. This particular image had graphic design elements that were shot intentionally, and I've done this a few times, where I have a model stand in one place and the camera is locked down on a tripod. I have them change their position or possibly change their clothes and fit back into the previous pose. And once I have the original digital images, they're printed out, they're torn up and then reassembled to create the new Gestalt image. I know there are people out there who have a little bit of fear in manipulating or destroying their images, but if it's any consolation, usually we are starting from digital images, which means we can make multiple prints. If you make a mistake on one, simply make another print and try again. One of the most liberating ways of creating new kinds of compositions is realizing that your frame does not have to conform to a rectangle or a square format. And there are many artists out there, myself included, who incorporate a lot of collage elements in their photographs. This might take the form of multiple images collaged together, or by using other things like paper textures and physical objects. The artist David Hockney is well known for his Polaroid collages, where he utilizes multiple physical Polaroids, and they might conform to a particular rectangle or square shape, but generally it is one that would not fit in the specific type of frame you would get when you walk into the art store. So these are artists who have created unusual perimeters of their frames in the real world. There is definitely ways to digitally collage your work and create unusual frames within that context. One method I like is utilizing Adobe Photoshop's photo merge. Photo merges are essentially created by shooting overlapping frames and importing them into the software and asking the software to stitch them together. Typically, this leaves you with a very unusual border, one that does not conform to a normal rectangle. And typically people will crop these down so they do conform to a rectangle, but for maybe visual interest reasons or for keeping all of the data within the images together, or possibly just the general aesthetic of having a chaotic border, you do not have to crop this down. I utilize several apps that create photo merges with these unusual glitchy edges to them. Photosynth is an application that simply requires you to photograph within it, and you see ghost images of your previous shot. You can overlap them, and you can walk forward and backwards. Photosynth will create a virtual environment, and it is bound to have a lot of glitches to it. You can use it for landscapes, you could use it for people portraits. It's not necessarily the most highest resolution way of doing your photography, but it is a way of creating unusual compositions that really couldn't have been created with any of the past traditional methods. As a photographic artist myself, I feel like it's useful for us to explore whatever new technologies can create new kinds of imagery. It might work for our style, it might not work, but I feel like all artists have a responsibility to themselves to try new things, explore new things, and work with some of the language and tools that are unique to the era that we live in. That's how we create artwork that is relevant to our time. There are many alternatives to displaying your work besides putting them in a traditional square rectangle frame. You can have them professionally printed at any size and scale, and then have the printer cut around the edges of it and mount it onto museum board. For things like my instant film collages, I might utilize a wire and clip system to hold them on a wall. I've seen work in galleries hung with a simple magnetic system. Don't let an unusual perimeter prevent you from exploring new ways of creating or exhibiting your photography. Similar to the notion of the glitchy exterior is the glitchy interior. This is where technology introduces randomized flaws to your image making. I actually like glitch photography quite a bit because as somebody who's done photography for a long period of time, I, as an artist, want to be surprised. So an analog way of introducing glitchiness into photography might involve using Lomo style cameras. Lomo is a company that encourages lo-fi film photography through use of plastic cameras, through old 20th century cameras that have a lot of flaws in them. And by flaws, I mean light leaks. Sometimes the film is scratched, there are overlapping frames. The kind of cameras that Lomo sells include the Diana, the Holga, and many Russian imports from the 1960s, 1970s. When you experiment with glitch lomography style photography, don't expect to get wonderful results every single time, but do expect to be surprised and have compositions that would have been hard to come up with if you had really took the time to plan them out. In this particular case, the number on the back of the medium format film imprinted onto the photograph with the young woman I was shooting at the time. Because light leaked through the small window that showed the film sequence number. It burned it directly onto the film and became ingrained within the image. I've utilized applications that introduce a deliberately glitchy element to the images. It could be a photograph, it could be a video. One of my favorite applications that does this is Glitch, and it's a little more creative than applying a simple filter. It has methods of reinterpreting an image, and when you play with these, hopefully you find something that you like. A lot of these I have actually pulled from video. One of the great things about the modern era of technology that we live in is we can shoot video at a high enough resolution where we can capture a whole swath of motion and select what we want to use as the photographic still long after the fact. So that's what I've done here. I chose particular moments in time from this model shoot, and I utilized the Glitch app to create this almost three-dimensional landscape kind of effect on my model. Whether it's analog or digital means, I feel like glitch artwork is 100% valid. It is no more, no less randomized than the street photographers of the 1960s who would go out an entire day and photograph what they found, what was presented to them, with no expectation of a particular person or thing or events happening in front of their camera. I also personally feel like glitched artwork speaks strongly to the kind of half organic, half digital lives that we find ourselves living in modern day America. Most photographic compositions are in a rectangular format. If you're using a medium format camera or something like Instagram, it's a square format, but essentially you're dealing with a box, and what's within the box and without the box is very important to understanding photographic composition. Traditional composition might mean rule of thirds, where you divide the picture up into three segments, both vertically and horizontally. The idea is you put interesting things in these intersections, because that way you're creating movement for the viewer's eye. Photographic composition is both an essential way to tell a story and also to keep your viewer engaged by having them look around your photo, not look straight at the center and see the one important thing that's in a photograph. This particular composition strategy is one I call fill in the blanks, which means you are intentionally leaving things outside of the frame that make the viewer interested in what's going on. And in fact, you're engaging the viewer's mind to fill in what is not happening within this rectangular box. One strategy is to have a viewer gaze off of the frame, look off to the side, react to something that we don't see. This is a trick that a lot of times people do at sporting events or other kind of event photography, where they turn around and photograph the audience instead of what is on the stage or on the field. Another way to have the viewer fill in the blanks is to just be very ruthless with where we cut the frame. So we cut the frame down a portion of a person. Now, if you take a traditional composition class, oftentimes you are advised not to cut people off at the joints, at the hands, at the feet, at the knees, because it does look a little odd, and it begs the question, why not just move the camera, a very small quarter of an inch, so you can incorporate things like hands and feet. And while in principle I generally agree with this, it really depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. Not every photograph needs to feature someone's face and someone's facial expression for me to capture an emotion. In fact, things that are cut off, that are left a little bit more anonymous or mysterious, tend to engage the wider public more, because not only are we filling in the blanks with our own mind, but we are able to put ourselves in the shoes of what is happening on the screen. Arno Minikin is a self-portrait photographer, and he has made an entire career of photographing himself in mysterious circumstances amongst landscape features. So you'll see portions of his arms, his legs. A lot of him is cut off in these images, and he blends in incredibly well with whatever environment he finds himself in. They're very mysterious. They not only beg the question, where is the rest of this guy, but also, how did he do it? A lot of these circumstances seem quite dangerous, or they seem impossible. By having the viewer fill in the blanks, Arno is engaging his audience and keeping them looking at his photographs a lot longer than the kind of images that present everything to the viewer. Another of my favorite photographers who uses this technique a lot is Ren Hang. And Ren was a Chinese photographer who did these very bright color images, used very strong flash that knocked out most of the shadows. And in a sense, there's no mystery, but because the scenarios he presents are so strange, and where he places the frame tends to be very strange, that is something that has just this incredible oddness and artificiality, yet it feels very organic at the same time, because mostly Ren presents people in plain circumstances. He presents them nude. Sometimes he features plants or animals. Very rarely does he have anything that's not an organic substance in front of his camera. I love the near randomness of his placement of the frame in these images, though. Things are cut off in awkward fashion, as if there's action happening not just in front of the camera, but on the other side of the camera. And by action, I mean the photographer himself is falling over or running and chasing things, trying to capture moments without deliberately aiming his camera. And it's a strategy I've used a lot myself. I utilize a lot of instant film cameras where I can't necessarily compose the way I could with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, where I could actually see 100% what I'm aiming at. And I find the images that have this unusual off balance to them, that have the frame chop off some important features, these are the images that keep my interest the most. In my opinion, whatever you can do to activate the mind of anyone in your audience, any viewer, get them to try and solve the puzzle that you're presenting, that can only be a good thing. In this lesson, I want to talk about the concept of randomized reality. Essentially, we are talking about the messiness of the real world, usually presented as a snapshot aesthetic, or picking subjects that have randomness baked into them and presenting that as straightforward as possible. So we'll talk about the snapshot aesthetic first. This ties into having things cut off in the frame that a magazine talking about perfect composition would tell you not to cut off in the frame. But the snapshot aesthetic is not just the purview of amateurs. It's actually quite popular and very common in highfalutin photography magazines, in fashion magazines. And I feel like the reason why it's so popular and so prevalent is because the majority of the photography of the world is of the snapshot aesthetic. It's of the moment. And what we have come to realize as a society is that time will make anything into art. So the idea that you have to have perfectly composed images that are super clean, shot against perfect backdrops with perfect lighting, history does not make that any more or less art than having things that have personality, that have randomness, that showcase real life. I definitely think it is okay to approach compositions with a snapshot aesthetic, meaning you don't seek perfection, you don't seek proper placement of every single item in the photograph, and you embrace things that are real, that are really happening. You don't worry about things like cars in the background, passersby, and so on and so forth. My thought process is, if you are a creative person and you approach things in your natural life with an artistic mind, you're going to end up with very artistic portraits, very artistic landscapes or cityscapes or street photography, even if you are embracing the snapshot aesthetic. Many of the street photographers of the 1960s worked within this snapshot aesthetic because somebody like Gary Winogrand generally didn't tell his subjects that he was photographing them. He did it in a bit more of a sort of spy fashion. And ultimately, if he got a look out of a person that he liked, if other elements fell into place that made him happy, it didn't matter if there were random elements around him. Now, embracing subject matter that has randomized elements to it is a little difficult to describe in words, so I'm going to show you the work of some local Arizona artists. Julie Anand is somebody who was a professor at ASU when I went there, and she had a project where she would demarcate an area and find all of the junk in it. So these are like open lots, areas out in the desert. She would pick up all this particular trash and she would shoot it against a white background and then present it in this sort of gridded format. This is what was where she was. And you might say to yourself, what does that actually mean? Well, in one sense, it's exploring the mystery of what's really in the desert, what's really in these open lots. And in another sense, it's showcasing how trashy humanity can be and how environmentally unconscious we are in our actions. Another person I knew through ASU, Paho Man, would simply photograph the drawers of people he knew. And what this did was create a portrait of a person through what they had in their drawer without actually showcasing the person. And you could do this approach with almost any sort of object, like photographing people's beds around the world. This is a project I've seen and felt was really heartbreaking because you saw that children around the world live vastly different lives. Some borderline homeless, sleeping on floors, other ones living this incredible life of luxury. And when you looked at it as a complete series, however reality set up these environments, that's what was photographed. There were no changes. There was no Matthew Brady style rearranging of the objects or the people to create a better composition. It was stark reality, and each photo effectively told its story. Guys, I want to thank you so much for sticking with this class on cutting-edge photography composition. You should never be made to feel like because you are operating outside of rule books that there is not going to be a interest in your work. As I said at the beginning of the class, almost all of the people that we celebrate as the great artists, the great innovators, were the people who learned the rules and then went past those rules, threw the rule book out. And if you are simply aping things that you've heard in classes, it's unlikely that your compositions are going to stand out when placed next to the thousands of other photos that we see in our daily lives, be them on websites like 500px, things like Instagram. You have to be bold to stand out and really capture people's attention in the modern era. I happen to live in Arizona, and I'm very close to many national parks in California, Utah, New Mexico, and of course Arizona. And I have always felt if you go to these places, you need to bring something of yourself with you, and you need to make some challenging photographic compositions, because what's the point of not doing that? You might as well buy the postcards that they have available, unless you're willing to try something different and create imagery that's not the same as the postcards. And the same goes for the work that I create, whether it's portraiture, family stuff, fashion stuff, working with objects or pets. There's always a way to push the boundaries of a composition and keep your viewers' interest and keep your interest in photography as well. Once again, I hope you got a lot out of this class. Feel free to check out the rest of my courses on my teaching channel. There's a lot about photography and other forms of multimedia art and Adobe software as well. Talk to you next time.